Postmodern architecture is going to have a few key common elements, but of course we're going to see a wide variety of architectural ideas under postmodernism. After all, we're covering a fairly broad period of time, and we're seeing that increasing development of individuality, which means we're going to have a lot of individual sub-movements under the umbrella of postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is really reacting against what we call the international style or modernism, this idea that buildings should exist for a utilitarian purpose. And we see that here in Chicago. As we look at the skyline, what you'll notice is we have our international Lakeshore towers here. So large rectangles covered in steel and glass. You remember that they're cantilevered, that the glass on the outside and the steel on the outside is basically a facade, which is an interesting juxtaposition when you consider the Art Deco tower right here and a more postmodern tower in the form of the John Hancock building. So what are they doing to change things? Well, once again, postmodern architecture is going to look back at the classical. It's going to incorporate elements of that, but usually with a sense of whimsy, a sense of wonder. They're going to change the scale of things. So oftentimes they're going to be slightly smaller in scale, in feeling, even though we might be dealing with something like the Willis Tower or the Hancock Tower, which of course are massive. So we're back to that idea of modern is less is more, whereas postmodern, less is a bore. We're going to see that incorporation of classical elements, classical architectural elements, not just from the classical world, used to create a certain playfulness and usually an air of the sculptural when we look at the structures. Speaking of an air of the structure of the sculptural, here we see the Disney Opera House. And this is in Los Angeles. And here there are a couple of things that are standing out. First of all, this is the architect looking at the building, not just as a piece of architecture as the modernists would, but looking at it as sculpture. So creating these fine lines, when you drive by, the effect is that you know immediately that it's some kind of art center. It must be. Who else would be that creative? You couldn't see a major accounting firm housed in a building like that. Another element that he's using is going to be modern materials. You see it sheeted in stainless steel. So he's giving it that futuristic look, almost vintage futurist, as if he's standing in the 1950s looking towards what they thought 2000 might look like and designing a building based on that. So it's this interesting sort of vintage futurist element that tends to come out. We will also see the idea of using the structural components as decorative elements. Here we see Pompidou Center in Paris, and very famously here the architects have actually taken all of those usually interior elements, the ventilation, hallways, etc., and moved it all to the exterior of the building. The advantage is they've got a massive open space inside because they've taken all those elements outside, but it also stands out as sculptural and yet whimsical. It almost looks like a little hamster track running up the stairs to the various levels. And then the use of large pieces of color, very similar to De Stijl, to some of the other movements of the modern period. So very interesting ideas, but always whimsical, sculptural. There will always be some classical element thrown in. So it's very different from the world that we've just come from modernism. It is utilitarian, but the idea is that people need a certain aesthetic in their life. It's very much modernism plus arts and crafts, that idea of the aesthetic as being required in life, coming together to create postmodernism.